Welcome, friends, to another video lecture for Paul as local theologian. We are nearing the end of our class, and I think we're getting into the point of the class where hopefully we can begin to create a wonderful conversation with the letters of Paul and a little bit of what we've read about Paul as a theologian and what we've read about local theology. And for this lecture, this is the first lecture where we will be engaging one letter of Paul in particular, and we'll do this for the subsequent 2 or 3 weeks after this video lecture. And the topic for this lecture is 1 Thessalonians. And what I hope to do in this lecture is provide a brief introduction and overview of 1 Thessalonians. This may be a review for you, or it may be new information, but either way, hopefully it'll give us a bit of a grounding point and the ability to have some shared conversation. Then I want to just briefly walk through the various sections of 1 Thessalonians and point out a couple of things of interest and import. And then I want to conclude sort of with a more creative prospects of Paul as a local theologian in 1 Thessalonians. That third part of the lecture will be where I do my best to at least engage some of our work on local theology as I see it in 1 Thessalonians. To begin, 1 Thessalonians is, by all accounts, or most accounts, the earliest writing in the New Testament. It's the very first or earliest Christian writing that we know of. It's most certainly Paul's earliest letter, Pauline scholars would tell us. And so what do we know? Well, we know that Thessalonica was the capital city of the Roman province of Macedonia, that it was near the Aegean Sea, that there was significant devotion to the imperial cult, to the Roman religious practices venerating the Roman emperor, that it remained culturally a very Greek city, governed by Greek laws even after the ascent of Rome and the Roman Empire. And that it was located in this trade route known as the Via Egnatia, which most certainly led the city to have some commercial prosperity. So it is we might call it an urban environment. We would call it a place that would be familiar with Greek culture, things like Greek philosophical discourse, Greek values, Greek ideals, and yet also would have been conversant with the imperial cult, would have been conversant with the imperial system. We learn about Paul's relationship with the Christians at Thessalonica, both from 1 Thessalonians, but also from the book of Acts. It's first of all important to notice that 1 Thessalonians opens as a letter not just from Paul, but from Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy. This group of 3 Christian workers are important. They have a particular relationship with the Thessalonican Christians. According to 1 Thessalonians 2 and Acts 16, Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy first came to the city of Thessalonica after they experienced some hardship in Philippi. They started a church there in Thessalonica, and according to Acts 17, the Paul and Silvanus and Timothy were forced to leave after some pressure from the Jewish community in that city. We learn from Acts, again, that Silvanus and Timothy remain in the city of Berea, while Paul went on to Athens. Eventually, Timothy makes his way up to Athens and converses with Paul, and Paul nearly quickly goes on to Corinth, and he seems to send Timothy and Silvanus to the Thessalonians, to the Christians living in Thessalonica. While Paul is in Corinth, he receives news from Timothy about the situation, about life on the ground in Thessalonica, and this is more likely than not the reason that Paul writes the letter to the Thessalonians. And this again reveals a pretty consistent pattern in Paul's letters, that Paul has an origin story with these communities, that Paul worked to create a Christian community there and then traveled away from them, but remained in contact with them, remained in correspondence with them, both through his co-workers like Timothy or Silvanus, but also through letters. And so First Thessalonians gives us lots of the classic and important features of Paul's ministry as an apostle and church planner. With that intro of the relationship between Paul and the Thessalonians and about the city of Thessalonica, let me walk through, just briefly through, the letter itself. The letter opens in chapter 1, verses 1 through 10, with some of the warmest and most encouraging language of all of Paul's letters. It's clear that Paul has a close connection, that the Thessalonians have a dear place in his heart. Again, there is the co-authorship that we see in 1:1, and this deep relationship, a coordinating relationship. Again, here is just a little plug for local theology. Paul is not a solitary genius, right? Paul is working in community with co-workers and engages those communities that he writes to as well in that process. He commends the Thessalonians for their work of faith, for their labor of love, for their steadfastness of hope, standard Christian virtues that we'll see elsewhere in the New Testament. He highlights their reputation among other Christians in the region. Their behavior and their disposition has taken notice. They become model citizens, model Christians rather, for others. And he notes in this very first 10 verses their experience of persecution, which and hardship, which I think becomes a key thing, a key problem that First Thessalonians addresses. Then in chapter 2, verses 1 through 16, Paul reminds the Thessalonians of his initial presence with them. He and his co-workers, the way they showed up in the community, how they shared the gospel of God, how they lived in a particular way, how they were non-reliant on others, how they spoke with authenticity. Here we see, especially in verses 3 through 8, Paul drawing on the language of the ideal philosopher, drawing on what I would call cultural traditions that were in the water in Thessalonica, that he's drawing on in order to remember and represent himself and his co-workers as sort of the ideal philosophers, the ideal pastors, if you will. He's drawing on some cultural knowledge in order to do that. Again, we have the language of persecution here in chapter 2 presenting itself again. Then in 2:17 through 3:13, Paul shares his concern, his anxiety about the Thessalonians and Timothy's report. In 2:17, Paul makes this great line about he and his co-workers had been made orphans by their distance from the Thessalonians. It's kind of the opposite of how the Thessalonians might have been feeling, about feeling abandoned or left behind from their Christian leaders. Again, there's language of the gospel of Christ, mention of not being shaken by persecution, and that Timothy's report has really provided an encouragement to Paul and his co-workers who themselves are facing persecution, and the report from Timothy gives them an encouragement in order to help them face those persecutions. Paul expresses sort of his hope, his prayer for the Thessalonians, that first, that he would be able to visit them soon. Second, that they would continue to increase in their love for one another. And three, that they would be sort of secured and set apart in holiness, in their distinctiveness, and the distinctiveness of their lifestyle and way of living in that Greek cultural world of Roman hegemony. In chapter 4, Paul, I think, reiterates or reminds them of what this life looks like, a life of love for one another and a life of holiness. It includes things like living and pleasing God as the overall purpose of this individual and communal life. He talks about the will of God being that of sanctification, again, set apartness, a distinct way of inhabiting the world is the goal. And in addition to sanctification, there's also a love of other Christians, of the brothers or the siblings in Christ, which, according to the end of the end of this section, 4:1 through 12, love of siblings includes things like quiet living, minding your own business, and working with your hands. It's not just emotional, but it's practical. It's community building, community supporting, community upbuilding sorts of behaviors. Then in 4:13 through 5:11, Paul, I think, responds to something that he probably heard from Timothy about a concern about the death of believers and about the return of the Lord. We have this language of grieving like others who do not have hope, the avoidance of a grief like others who do not have hope in 4:13. Again, I think this presents a local question: is who does Paul have in mind of those who grieve without hope? Is it the Epicurean philosophers who do not believe in the resurrection or the afterlife? What is that reference to? There's also in 5:3 a reference to those who say peace and security, which were sort of bywords. They were like billboard words for the Roman Empire, and Paul seems to be saying those messages are false because the real peace and the real security will come with the Lord's return. And then, of course, this bit about paying attention. In 5:12 through 22, there is some more information, some more talking through the community of character, the way of upbuilding, the way of living life, a life that is characterized by love, faith, and hope, by a distinctive community orientation and by distinctive love for each other. And then Paul closes the letter in 5:23 through 28 with a benediction and some final greetings. So that's an outline and an overview of 1 Thessalonians. Let me revisit now, in conclusion, the question of Paul as a local theologian, the degree to which Paul's theological work in 1 Thessalonians can be understood through the framework of local theology, or how it might connect with our readings on local theology. I think the first thing that should be obvious, at least to me, is that if we're looking for Paul to have a core or a coherent theology that is simply applied in 1 Thessalonians, it is hard to find it in 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians doesn't have a lot of the themes or motifs that we might associate with Paul. Things like justification by faith, or circumcision, debates about circumcision, or engagement with important figures from the Old Testament like Abraham or Moses. There's no discussion of the Jewish law. These things that seem to be central in other letters of Paul are not here present. And so instead of looking for core items and seeing how Paul has sort of applied them to this situation, I think Basler's suggestion about focusing on problems and then looking at how Paul thinks through those problems is more helpful. And I think that undergirds the sort of responsive nature of local theology, the doing theology spiral that we talked about earlier in the semester. So I see at least three persistent problems that Paul's letter to the Thessalonians is thinking through. The first is the problem of persecution and hardship. How does Paul respond to the reality of persecution that the Thessalonians are facing and that he and his coworkers are facing? That is a problem. What do we do? Why are we suffering? How do we endure suffering? I think 1 Thessalonians offers a number of Christian responses to that. It offers us a way to look at how Paul thinks through persecution and hardship. A second issue that I've already noted is that of the death of believers, the death of members of the Christian community, and the sort of uncertainty about the return of the Lord, and have they missed out on something. Again, I think that if we come to this part of 1 Thessalonians and say, this is Paul's theology of the return of the Lord, or this is Paul's theology of the end times, I think we're misguided. But if we see Paul thinking through an actual living, breathing problem, we begin, I think, to open up the ways in which Paul is thinking and responding. Finally, I think a third problem is the integrity of the community, particularly the integrity of the community in the absence of its founding leaders, Paul, Timothy, and Silvanus. I think that this is a problem that we can see in the beginning, middle, and end of 1 Thessalonians. And we see that Paul spends a lot of time doing theology, thinking theologically about the integrity of the community, about its upbuilding, about how life should be organized together and in this community. And so Paul is thinking through all of these things. He's thinking through in I think, a Christian way. So those are three problems that I think Paul is responding to. I think there's also local issues, including what Paul says about Jews and Jewish persecution in 2:14 through 16. This is a part of Paul's letter to the Thessalonians that has been debated because of how it sort of stands in tension with what Paul says about Judaism in Romans 9 and 11. And here again, rather than thinking or having to explain it as Paul's thought has changed, local theology gives us the opportunity to see Paul is seeing in his present moment, his present experience, and what is happening in Thessalonica, a connection. And that alone, that sort of connection, that timeliness, is all that we really need to hold on to, instead of thinking that Paul has to be consistent or coherent across his 15 or 20 years of his letter ministry, his writing ministry. Again, I've already highlighted the use of language that is drawn from Greek philosophy or Greek culture. Again, he's speaking a local language. He's describing himself and his co-workers and their work using concepts and language that is in the cultural water, we would say. And then finally, the whole question about hope that we see throughout 1 Thessalonians, we again could ask the question, is this sort of a vanilla understanding of Christian hope, or is Paul actually engaging other Greek cultural understandings of the afterlife, of hope or of hopelessness in his letter to the Thessalonians that might be, again, give us a local flavor to 1 Thessalonians? Well, I'm sure that we could say more about 1 Thessalonians, and I hope that our discussion forum this week will open up some more insight and some more questions about 1 Thessalonians. But I hope that it illustrates some of the generative conversation that we can have in this class together about Paul's letters, and local theology. Thank you so much, as always, for your time and your attention.